you all for joining us. As you can see, the program is being recorded, so it will be available to all our friends and league members who weren't able to make it today to be with us. My name's Patty Comfort. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. And again, I want to thank you all for being here today. Just a couple of housekeeping tips. As I mentioned before, we've got everybody muted as they entered the room. So if you could stay that way, that would be great. For purposes of questions, we're encouraging and inviting everyone to put their questions in the chat. And I will be monitoring those and reading those out for Michelle as we get to the Q&A portion of the meeting. So don't wait to put your questions. If you already have questions in your mind that you want to ask, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And as I said, we'll get to that after Michelle's presentation. So I also want to introduce Nancy Brumback, who along with myself represents the League on the Election Modernization Coalition, which is the group of organizations that spearheaded the advocacy around the Votes Act. So Nancy and I have been at that. She's been at it a lot longer than I have, every week, you know, for the past, well, 12 years for in Nancy's case. And I just want to take 2 minutes. Michelle's going to get into the weeds, obviously, but I just want to take a minute to kind of highlight, you know, we want to sort of win the win, as they say, and highlight what a huge reform the Votes Act is making in elections in Massachusetts, and just going to highlight the sort of the very broad changes that it's going to make. So unrestricted mail voting, we have that now as contrasted with absentee ballot restrictions. We have expanded in-person early voting. So early voting was allowed for the first time in a primary election during the pandemic, and now that is a permanent reform going forward. The voter registration deadline is 10 days before an election now, whereas before it was 20 days, so there's less of a blackout period. The Votes Act specifies accommodations for voters with disabilities. It makes jail-based voting information for folks that are incarcerated and otherwise eligible to vote. It allows for them to get information and access to the ballot box. And then just a few quick statistics. Before 2020, only 3 to 5% of Massachusetts residents voted by mail. And in 2020, nearly 42% voted by mail, 23% voted early, and then 35% on election day. So I think everyone on this call realizes, you know, the huge change that this law is going to make to our elections here in Massachusetts. So now I would like to introduce Michelle Tassinari, who has generously given her time to be with us today. Michelle is the Director and Legal Counsel and the Secretary of the Commonwealth's Election Division, and she was recently appointed as First Deputy by Secretary Galvin. She's a graduate of Brandeis University and New England Law. Ms. Tassinari is the state appointee to the Election Assistance Commission Standards Board. She's a member of the Bipartisan Policy Center Voter Registration Task Force. She's an advisory board member of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab and working group member of the Council of State Governments Overseas Voter Initiative. In 2020, Michelle was named as one of 50 top women of law by the Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly, and she is the immediate past president of the National Association of State Election Directors. And she recently just told me when I asked her how long she's been in the elections division, that she actually was an intern there in law school in 1995 and has basically been working there since 1998. So I think we can all agree that Michelle is the person to tell us how the Votes Act and its changes are going to be implemented here in Massachusetts, both in terms of the work that her office does, all the way down to what's going to be happening with the individual voter. So Michelle, thank you again for being with us, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Patty, and thanks, Nancy, and the rest of the league. I mean, it's a great opportunity for me to be here. I'm excited to talk to you about the Votes Act, and as Nancy was reminding me, previously, I think it was when the Help America Vote Act had first passed, we had done an in-person event way back in the day to kind of go over what changes would be impacted for that. So it's my pleasure to be here again today to go over the changes that are happening because of the Votes Act. What I wanted to do is basically start with kind of the way the Votes Act impacts voters, and then I'll cover the way that it impacts our office and then local election officials. So basically the Votes Act had the effect of making permanent changes that were made by the legislature in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So you'll remember that we started off 2020 with our in-person, primarily in-person presidential primary. It was the first presidential primary at which we had early voting in person, but that was through a special act of the legislature. And then quickly right after that, it seems like COVID hit. And then all of a sudden we transitioned to vote by mail. So the Votes Act essentially has codified many of the changes that were made in 2020. And those include allowing anyone to vote early by mail for any election, including municipal elections, special elections, state primaries, state elections, presidential primaries. One of the changes that is different from 2020 is the deadline to apply for a vote by mail ballot. The 2020 law had it as 4 business days before the election, and now it's 5 business days before. One of the reasons for that change is simply to address standard mail delivery times. Back in the day, the deadline to vote by absentee ballot was noon. To apply for it was noon the day before the election, which seems like it's setting someone up for failure. If they receive your application by noon the day before the election, there's essentially no time to put a ballot in the mail for you to get it, mark it, and then return it and have it received. So these are the changes that were made to reflect the reality of how long it takes to mail things. And then the other changes that happened in 2020 that are continuing are sending vote by mail applications to all registered voters. Hopefully you've all received them by now. We did send those out. They began going out a few weeks ago. We get confirmation when they are returned because they are postage prepaid back to your local election official. They allow you to apply for a ballot for the state primary, the state election, or all elections in the calendar year. And so they're hopefully easy to use, and we are seeing them being returned to our local election officials at a pretty high clip. There's been over 250,000 of them returned to local election officials already. And again, any form of written communication can also be used to request a vote by mail ballot, whether it's an absentee ballot or an early voting by mail ballot. And similar to the absentee voting laws, the Votes Act has made many of them consistent now with early voting by mail. So it allows a family member to apply on your behalf for an absentee ballot or an early voting ballot by mail. It allows a family member to hand deliver a ballot to back to the local election official for both an early voting ballot by mail or an absentee ballot. It allows the use of drop boxes for both of those. The other part that Patty was mentioning is early voting in person. So in 2020, we saw early voting in person expanded to be a longer period of time, and we think it was really successful. So even though we were going through a pandemic in 2020, we still had a high number of people who voted early in person. Some people just don't want to vote by mail. They want to vote in person. And by providing the opportunity to vote early in person for an extended period of time, including weekend hours, it really was able to offer many opportunities for people to vote. And those same extensions are now applying for 2022 and beyond. So there's mandated weekend hours for both the primary and the election. And there's a significant period of time where voters will have the opportunity to vote. So some of these things have been put into, some of the things from 2020 are slightly different now. So the timeframes for early voting in person, they're based on population. So there are some instances in which a city or town will have reduced hours, but that's based on the reduced number of registered voters that they currently have. And as Patty was mentioning, the voter registration deadline has been changed from 20 days down to 10. So prior to this law, the voter registration deadline was always 20 days before, and local election officials had to be open until 8 o'clock for voter registration. So now it's a reduced amount and only until 5 o'clock, but still offering voter registration from 9 to 5 for most places, except if the population is low enough. They have limited hours. And that happens to coincide with early voting in person. So there is essentially a very limited piece of early voting in person and same day registration at the same time. We were, as you can imagine, disappointed that there was no election day registration as part of the Votes Act. But that's a fight we're going to keep on fighting, because hopefully we'll be able to get that before 2024. We got to take what we can get when we can get it. So the Votes Act has other provisions that don't necessarily take effect for this election cycle, but they will kick in for the future election cycles, which, as Patty was mentioning, the voter education piece and providing information for people who are otherwise qualified to vote, but happen to be incarcerated. So we're working on materials now. It doesn't take effect until January. However, we are trying to work on materials so that we can get information out this year, because we do think it's something important. And in 2020, one of the things we did do was issue an advisory opinion on it that we circulated to our election officials, as well as hopefully we're able to get into all of the correctional facilities. So one of the questions that was asked was, how does this affect the state, and how does this affect local election officials? So I think it's interesting for to say that how does it affect the state? I don't really see a big deal for us. And the reason why I say I don't see a big deal for us was 2020, we did it. We've been there, we've done that. 2020, if you asked me this question in 2020, I may have fallen off my chair, because in 2020, again, we made this dramatic shift from primarily voting in person, providing training in person. Everything was based on being able to see and communicate with people. And then when the pandemic hit, we had to shift from an in-person voting process to a vote by mail process. Luckily for us, we had the benefit of the lessons learned from other places. So I am a member of the National Association of State Election Directors. And as soon as the pandemic hit, we started coordinating weekly meetings. And the first couple of meetings were very informative, because they were presentations essentially from Washington State, Oregon, Colorado, places that vote by mail, providing us with helpful information, best practices, documentation that they use. So it was much easier to kind of have that camaraderie and have those conversations and ask those types of questions, as opposed to starting from scratch. So, why reinvent the wheel when someone who has done it successfully can give us information to help us? So that was one of the benefits that we had in 2020 that I think continues moving forward. In 2020, one of the biggest challenges we had were resources. We had to we always contract for ballots, we always contract for envelopes, but we hadn't contracted for a mailing. And that was the first time we did a mailing. So we had to contract for the mailing. We had to get paper for the mailing. We had to get the supplies that we need for envelopes, because in 2020, that was the first time at which we used postage prepaid envelopes. So prior to 2020, we did provide envelopes to our election officials, and the return envelope that the voter uses to send their marked ballot back to the election official was generic. The local election officials would put their sticker on it with their return address, and then the voter would be responsible for affixing postage. In 2020, the law provided that the postage had to be prepaid. So we had to pivot from one generic mailing envelope to 351 separate mailing envelopes, all with specific artwork from the post office. Apply for 352 permits, business reply mail permits. And so one master permit, which we put all the funds in that would draw down. And then have all of this be approved and the artwork be approved through the Postal Service. So that was a huge challenge, and it was simply because it's not something that we had done. We hadn't been used to working in the post office. They've approved generic envelopes, but testing 351 of them was a challenge. The other challenge that we saw in 2020 was just the sheer volume of pieces of paper that were coming in, and that's going to continue this time. So in 2020, what we started doing also for our local election officials were kits. So we provided, because of the increase in the vote by mail, we provided kits to our local election officials that had the ballot in it, the instructions, the return envelope. What it didn't include was the envelope that the voter signs. And the reason why it didn't include that was because the local election officials can put a sticker on it to make it easier to track, and the sticker has a barcode. So we didn't want to have them pull it out, put the sticker on, and put it back in. So those came separately. We've continued that this year, which is great because I think it does save a lot of time, and our election officials certainly appreciate it. So while there were some challenges from our office, which are pretty administrative, some of the what we've seen happen, were great opportunities, is that because everyone was working remote and people are used to now using Zoom, we've been able to offer a lot more training. So in 2020, we traditionally would go to our local election officials at their meetings, whether they were regional or statewide, and offer training on various subjects. In 2020, because that wasn't happening, we decided instead to shift to Zoom meetings. But what we did was Zoom meetings at which they were very targeted for a particular topic. So we would do a topic on how to process vote by mail applications, how to how to effectively mail out the ballots, what to do when the ballots are returned, setting up your early voting in person location. And we just continued on topic questions. Sometimes we would literally just have a whole session of questions and answers. We recorded those so that our local election officials would be able to reference them at later times. With 351 local election officials, we were seeing on average at least 250 people on every one of the Zooms. So that worked out so well. We're doing it again this year. We're updating our presentations to make sure that we are able to provide that every Thursday. They have a class that they can sign up for, and we generally have between 250 and 350 people participating, which is great because it gives them an opportunity to, we can demonstrate how to do things in our statewide system. We've also seen a pretty high turnover in election officials. So what they may have missed in 2020, they can pick up this year because they weren't there in 2020. So, one of the challenges that we had this year was because of the supply chain issues. It was really hard to guesstimate what we were going to need for supplies. And I think that was the biggest challenge that we faced coming into this, especially knowing that what we were looking at for the increase in costs, just purely based on shortages, and then physically trying to get paper. So at the time when we needed to issue these contracts, the Votes Act hadn't passed, and there were two different competing versions. One of them had one mailing, one of them had two mailings, one of them had postage prepaid envelopes, one of them didn't. So we had to kind of try to figure out through our budgeting process and our contract process how to get the supplies we needed in order to be able to meet the requirements, whatever they were going to be. We always err on the side of caution, and I would rather have too many supplies than not enough. So we were sure that we made sure that we ordered the paper for the mailing in advance. We figured if we didn't use it for, we're definitely going to have to do one mailing, if not two. So let's order enough for two mailings just in case. We were lucky to be able to get that. Then the paper for the envelopes, all of the envelopes. Couldn't print the envelopes because we didn't know what was going to be on them. Was it going to be a generic one, or was it going to be a postage prepaid envelope? All of these things have at least led to some sleepless nights for us. And we're hearing about the paper shortages and the supply chain issues happening around in other states. So we were fortunate that we are able to get the information we need and get the paper supplies that we need. And we have some great vendors that have been really accommodating to us to make sure that they're getting things printed and delivered in a proper time frame to be efficient. So when it comes to the Votes Act, does it have a huge impact on our office? No, we're going to run the election how we have to, no matter what. And we're going to get it done. Most of the heavy lifting, or 98% of the heavy lifting, is done by our local election officials. They are the heroes of democracy. So when you think about all of the additional work that is done, it's done at a local level. And we often don't see most of it. I mean, we know what needs to get done. I'm not physically sitting in someone's office doing it. So it's hard for us to sometimes ask them to do things. So it is important that we collaborate with our election officials to make sure that if we're implementing a process, if we're promulgating a regulation, that we're doing it in a way that doesn't hurt them and that it actually makes their jobs easier. And I will be totally frank with you. I'm sure there are some clerks on here who will be like, I'm pretty sure you guys implemented some stuff that we can't do. So some of the things that have increased for our election officials as part of the Votes Act, which again, were similar issues in 2020. As I mentioned, the pure volume of paper coming in. So all of the applications that come in, you have to check them to see, is this person a registered voter? If they're using a plain application, you have to enter them into the statewide database. You have to check, did they request the party have a ballot that they're not registered in? Then you have to notify them if they didn't. And these are things that happened before the Votes Act. These are just things that the volume has increased significantly because of the Votes Act. I don't think it's a bad thing. The increase in the workload is definitely tough, but it also means there's an increase in participation and interest. And I think that, you know, all of the election officials, whether they're a staff of 1 or a staff of 10 or a staff of 20, will agree that it's a lot of work, but if it's helping democracy and it's getting people to vote, then it's totally worth it. And so that's where I think there is the opportunity for people to help. Some of the things that are needed is to essentially open envelopes. Not everyone has an automatic paper opener, envelope opener. And sometimes you don't want to use them because what if you're going to slice the ballot? Checking that the inner envelopes have signatures on them. Those are things that take time. Sorting them into the right precinct and the right party. All of those things are increased activities that the cities and towns are seeing with just the sheer volume. Now, it's unclear at this point whether we'll see 2020 be the numbers that we hit in 2020 for 2022. I don't know that we'll hit that, but 2020 was great. It was awesome that we had a huge turnout and we were able to accommodate the voters, and we had relatively smooth process, including the increase in people that were voting on election day as well as early voting by mail. But one of the problems we have been seeing, at least in 2022, one second, is an increase in people asking more questions about the process. And while it's great that people want to know more about the process, unfortunately, it is kind of, sometimes it can be a time suck. There's a lot to do, and explaining things with random questions that come in can sometimes be difficult. And it does seem like, based on things that are happening in other states and reports that people are seeing, that there are some people who don't trust the process. So it would be certainly helpful if we can all work together to make sure that people are aware of how we do things, how the process works, and what to expect both before election day, on election day, and after election day. So the Votes Act is gonna, for the November election at least, it is going to result in not having unofficial results even on election night. Ballots can come in up to 3 days after the election, because the third day after the election this year is a holiday. It will be on Saturday. Excuse me. It will be on so the deadline will then get bumped to Saturday for ballots to be received by the mail. So we're working with the post office on that. But some people think that if you don't have immediate results, there's got to be something wrong. So that is one of the benefits of the Votes Act, is that you can receive the ballots late. One of the downsides is people are going to be suspect of why are the results changing? And we saw that happen in other states, not necessarily here in 2020, where the shift from the ballots that came in and the numbers that changed because the ballots came in after election day were changes. And so people automatically distrust the process, primarily because they don't understand. And that's something that we're going to be working on to do a voter education campaign, both through voters as well as with the media, because sometimes, unfortunately, they also don't understand why things are happening. So to be able to get that information out there accurately is something that's important. So some things that I think the league could be helpful with, as I was mentioning, is, reaching out to your election officials. There's always something to do. Some volunteer positions that are available. And I know this because my daughter, who's in high school, also has to do community service, and it's always going to be related to our town clerk. She last year she sorted street list forms when they came in. This year, I'm pretty sure she's going to be using a glue stick on ballot envelopes. She's got lots of stuff to do. She's got lots of hours to fill. Town hall's right down the street. So she's going to bring some friends. They all need the community service, and it's a great way to become familiar with the process. Sorting papers, working the polls either during early voting or on election day. Poll workers are something that are usually hard to come by, and there's never enough. And even if there are enough, they could use more. You need backup. And even if there's enough poll workers, they need greeters. Oftentimes it's helpful to have someone who's at the front door telling them where to go, whether it's you're in Ward 1, Precinct 1, or you're in Precinct 2, which line is the right line to go in. And just having that information to say, once you get your ballot, bring it over to the ballot box. And just to have enough people to guide the polling locations. And the beauty of one of the things in the Votes Act that is particularly helpful is that it does allow for the appointment of poll workers up with 6 weeks before the election. If there are vacancies, they don't have to rely on lists. You don't even have to be a registered voter. You don't have to be a citizen to be a poll worker. And 3 weeks before the election, if the clerks don't have enough, the clerks are the ones who get to appoint. So there's a great opportunity to be able to fill in those gaps, because again, I think or at least most election officials would welcome the opportunity to have more poll workers as opposed to less, especially if you're willing to volunteer. And again, there's going to be a permanent change that was part of the Votes Act is pre-processing ballots. And that was a huge issue prior to 2020, where the way in which ballots were processed were always on election day. So all the ballots had to go through the machine the same way as if it was at a polling location. And you can imagine the amount of vote by mail ballots can hold that up during the day. So in 2020, the law allowed for a pre-processing, and that will continue. It's still an open and transparent process, but it just means that voters won't have to wait while ballots are being fed through a tabulator if the local election official decides to process that way. And again, one of the important things I think of is just reminding people about how easy it is to vote. The Votes Act is making sure that there are opportunities for everyone to vote in the way that is most convenient for them, whether it's in person during the early voting period, whether it's on election day itself. And again, some people still want to vote on election day, whether it's by mail, whether it's absentee because they meet one of the qualifications, or whether it's just the no excuse early voting by mail. These opportunities exist. It's easy to get a ballot. Local election officials, the more people that vote early by mail, the easier it is for them to predict what their election day will look like. So there are opportunities for that as well. And again, this is the reduction of the early vote, the voter registration deadline. Part of that was unfortunate is that 10 days before a Tuesday is always a Saturday. So the voter registration deadline for all state elections will be on a Saturday. And unfortunately, the hours for early voting in person on those Saturdays don't line up with what they are required to do for voter registration. So hopefully our local election officials will be able to modify it to make sure that they're consistent, excuse me, and offer more early voting in person than they probably are required to. One of the things that I think would be also helpful is making sure that we're advocating for funding. Our local election officials are, I would suggest, underfunded. We provide them with extended polling hours. That's something that's been required since 1983. It's very limited. It's for 3 hours. The early voting law was considered a local mandate, which, one second, sorry. Hopefully we're better now. The local mandate law only allows for reimbursement for mandated costs, where much of the Votes Act provides for optional additional things, which are not necessarily covered. But I think one of the things we want to do is encourage that extra. We want to encourage our election officials to have expanded opportunities, to maybe have more than one early voting location, to have night and weekend hours beyond what is required. However, they don't get paid for those. The amount of staff it takes to run the early voting, both during the early voting period, meaning while people are voting, setting it up, processing making sure you're accounting for everything afterwards, takes time. And they're not getting the funding for that. So that's something that I think we can all work together to make sure that they are being adequately supported as they move forward. Sorry. I haven't coughed all day until today, until right now, as I decided to talk. So, so I apologize for that. But again, I think the Votes Act is a great opportunity to continue our expansion of voting in Massachusetts. And I'm here to answer any questions if you want to move into questions now. Or...
Yep, that sounds great, Michelle. Thank you so much. Voice a little bit of a break. Thank you. That was super informative and helpful. And so what I'll do is I just been taking notes on questions, so I'm just going to start at the top. So Carlin Reed from our league in Concord Carlisle asks, does the Secretary of the Commonwealth require signature verification of ballot applications? If so, how does the Secretary's office recommend the process be done?
So the law actually requires a verification from the application to the envelope, not when the application is received. So when the application is received, you're only checking to see, is that person a registered voter? And then the law, which is the 2020 law did not contain this, but the 2022 law does, is that it requires that the application be matched against the envelope when the voter returns it. And that's something that was required on absentee ballots previously, but not on the early voting by mail ballots. But now that is a requirement for 2022. Again, the application versus the envelope that comes back.
Okay, thank you. Carol Young Kleinfeld sends greetings from her good friend Peggy Reeves in Connecticut.
Oh, I love Peggy.
Greetings to you. And her question is, she knows that this is not necessarily Votes Act driven, but she says how the drive-only licenses will be handled by the statewide voter registration system. She says she knows it's not part of the Votes Act, but a lot of people at shopping centers are asking. I'm assuming she's registering people out at those shopping centers.
Yeah, so right now there is the referendum circulating, so they're probably at the shopping centers, and who knows what they're telling people. Right. As to what the Votes Act will do. My understanding is one of the reasons why the governor vetoed it was he said that he was fearful that people who were not qualified because they are not US citizens would register to vote. I don't agree with that. And the reason why I don't agree with that is because currently you don't have to be a US citizen to get a driver's license. You could just be here. You could be here with a green card and you can still get a driver's license. So, you know, we are committed to working with the Registry of Motor Vehicles to make sure that however they categorize their records, that they don't accept in our system. So currently, the way in which people, when you go to the registry of motor vehicles and you're applying for a driver's license, when you're applying for a real ID, you have to verify your citizenship. So you have to provide the documentation. If that isn't provided, there should be no chance that you're going to be able to register to vote. So only if the boxes in their own system are checked will that count to us. So currently, so it wouldn't happen at the registry during a registry transaction. But maybe the fear is that through our online voter registration system. When our online voter registration system, when you are registering to vote through that system, it is hitting against the registry of motor vehicles. And it is determining whether your driver's license number, you can flag it to say that you can't use this to register to vote. And we currently do that if someone was flagged as in the registry for using suspected forged documents to get their original driver's license. So there is a way within the system so that they can prevent someone from being able to do it. And it would say you can't register to vote through our online system. Does that stop someone from submitting a paper application? No, but it doesn't now. So you're still signing a statement under the penalty of perjury on a paper form that you meet the qualifications. So I don't think that if the legislation is not repealed, that it will lead to this massive influx of ineligible people registering to vote. I mean, there's no benefit for it. I mean, I don't see, people aren't trying to do it now.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. And Nancy Brumback asked this question. The voter registration period will now overlap in-person early voting by a day before the primary and several days before the November election. Will people be able to register and vote right away during that overlap period?
They should, yeah. So, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning, there will be a period of time where there'll be the overlap. Some of it may just be limited to the location though, because the voter registration is going to be at the clerk's office. And if they're using a satellite location for voter registration, for early voting, there may be some challenges there, and we're trying to work with our election officials so that it is a seamless process that can happen and that you don't have to send someone somewhere else to register.
Great. Awesome. Janet Lauer is asking this question. Is there any plan for technology updates to make it easier to prepare mail-in ballots and tabulate results to make the process more efficient and less likely for human error? What have other states done?
So there is technology out there. I think one of the questions is who's paying for it? So there are some places, I think in 2020, there were a lot of private funding grants that were available. And I know that some places took advantage of that and were able to get some equipment that is mailing equipment that opens things or addresses things and sorts things. That's expensive technology. And I think the challenge that we see here is, again, with a municipal-based system of 351 cities and towns, it's not as easy to procure that type of stuff for that volume. In most of the states that do vote by mail, they're doing things on a county level. So you have a county office that is, first of all, a warehouse that they have to house all of the equipment and do all of the processing, which is very, very different than, a town clerk's office where her ballots are stored in a vault. That's like the size of a closet.
Okay. Kathy Lynch wants to know, are the laws updated on the Secretary of State website yet?
So we don't generally publish the laws. The laws are available on the legislature's webpage. We do have information on our website, and it was being updated as things were becoming effective. So the voter registration deadline has been updated. Last week, it still said 20 days because it still was 20 days based on the effective date. So we're working to do that. And in 2020, what we had done was issue election advisories, which we posted on our website. 2022, we're looking to do a similar series which will also be posted.
Great. To the extent that you know this, Michelle, Rosemary Shields asked, what has been the reaction to the Votes Act from the town clerks and election officials?
I mean, it was an interesting time when the conference committee report was released, because I was driving to the clerks conference and had slides prepared for what I thought it would be. It was different. So it's always a challenge. I mean, I think that at this point, I think there was some disappointment that it took so long. But I think knowing what the rules are and that they're not going to keep changing, which was happening 2020, we had rules, 2021, we had rules. I think that is a relief. And I think it's positive in that there's an expectation of what the workload will be. And I think that as much as I want election day registration, the fact that it wasn't part of this right now was probably a relief, because we got to take, as I said, baby steps to get the process known and to get it, to work through any of the kinks before we move on to something new.
Yeah, okay. And the last question in the queue is from Lucy Kennedy. So I encourage, if other people have questions, please put them in the chat now if you want to ask anything. The question is, how can league members and volunteers sign up to help with vote processing? Do they just call their city election official, their town clerk?
Yep, definitely. Get in touch with your local election official. We have a listing of them all on our website. So there is the ability to be able to just get in touch with them. And also, if for some reason your election official says they're all set, in 2020, one of the things we did was have like a poll worker recruitment page on our website. Because some people may already have enough poll workers, but you can always vote. The requirement is to be a poll worker is also just to be a registered, currently, until you get into the 6 weeks before, to be a registered voter in Massachusetts. You don't have to live in the city or town where you want to be a worker. So some of the places that might be have challenges are larger places that maybe not where you live, but making those opportunities available and reaching out to election officials in the larger places where they do require more staff generally is probably something that would be helpful.
Yeah, great suggestion. Couple more questions, Michelle, come in. So yeah. Sorry to prolong your your tickle in your throat.
No,
what happens with the mail ballot when someone gets a mail ballot but decides to vote in person?
So that's a great question. So if you receive a mail ballot, you can still vote in person. The only time you wouldn't be able to vote in person is if they have received your ballot back. So prior to 2020, you used to be able to beat your ballot back to the polling location for an absentee ballot. So as long as your ballot hadn't been processed at the polling location, you could go vote in person, but that has now changed. So once your ballot is received back, I voted my ballot, I put it in a drop box, the clerk has checked it, it's checked off on the voters list that it's been received back. Now you can't vote in person, but as long as you haven't returned the ballot, the marked ballot, back to the election official, then you can certainly vote in person, whether it's during early voting or on election day. But don't try to trick your election officials. People have done this in 2020. I know, 2020, there were people who were trying to test the system. And so they would come and say, oh, I haven't returned my ballot. They'd vote in person. And then literally 5 minutes later, the clerk would go empty the drop box and they tried to put the marked ballot in the drop box. They're going to catch you.
Wow. Okay. This is a question. Can you talk more about jail-based voting and the Votes Act? How exactly are the reforms being implemented and what does that timeline look like?
So the timeline starts in January, and it does require us to send materials to correctional facilities about the voter registration process. Most of the in-depth work for that is done by the administrators of the facilities. So we're just providing information about the deadline to register, how to apply for a ballot, and all of those things. And we're certainly already working on those materials so that we do have so that we can provide them before January. We obviously want to make sure that we might not to be able to fully implement it, all of the particulars that need to get done. But we certainly are working with the administrators to get information out there. Maybe not all of the things that are required by January, but to make sure that there is a base level of understanding and that the resources are available.
Michelle, here's another question. What are the plans to educate the media and have them as information partners? Will there be, you know, sort of TV spots and that kind of thing? Or...
Yes, so we are working on some materials for both early voting, in person, vote by mail. There is an ad that's going now, which is a cartoon. There'll be also information that we put in the Information for Voters booklet that we mail to every household. Those books go out in September. So that'll have a lot of information in it as well. And they do go to every household and they're available in multiple languages. And then getting information on our website. Now we certainly do work with the media to issue press releases. We're trying to develop a communications toolkit for our local election officials so that they can spread the information to local news outlets as well. And that's something that we have already started to develop to get that information out there too.
Great. Here's a follow-up to the jail-based voting question. How will you be holding those administrators of the prison facilities accountable for providing that information?
So there is reporting requirements that they have to, I mean, there are requirements that they report certain information to us. I don't know that we have the independent ability to verify it or how we do it, but we are required to submit reports to the legislature. And then I don't know, honestly, I don't know how we're supposed to independently enforce it, at least based on the way the law is currently written.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Nancy, do you want to add anything here to close us out?
There's one more question from town clerk, from Karen Kale.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so she's saying, as a town clerk, I have to say that I do not see how it will be possible to allow a person to register and vote, quote unquote, right away. That person will not be on my eligible voter list. I would be extremely uncomfortable handing that person a ballot unless it is a provisional ballot. I foresee that the voter will be registered in the system and will appear on the eligible voter list 1 or 2 days later. Then they can vote.
So that's, I mean, I think there will be instances in which provisional ballots are used, but if someone is coming into your office, depending on how your early voting is set up, it could be very feasible. So in many places, the law requires that the clerk's office be used. So depending on the size of the municipality, it might physically be in the clerk's office, not just like a room across the hall. And someone would be able to have the ability to fill out the voter registration form. You can process them in our statewide database pretty quickly, add them as a voter, and then also add them as an early voter, because that's the way some clerks do early voting generally, is that they're automatically processing them as they come in our statewide database. They're not doing a separate list of eligible voters. They're using the database as a live database, which it is. But again, I can see a provisional ballot is something where you can certainly treat it as a provisional ballot, at least until it is verified, if you're not processing the voter registration form immediately.
Okay. Karen Epstein is asking, is early voting always the same number of days before an election?
It is not. So it's a different time period before the primary versus an election. So for a biennial state election, it's from the 17th day through the 4th day before the election. And for state and presidential primaries, it's the 10th day before the primary and ends on the 4th day before. So it always ends on the Friday before election day.
Okay, thank you. Not sure if this is for us or for you. Do you plan to develop a central location for all mass voters to find early voting information? In 2020, it was massearlyvote.com, but now that goes to the Secretary of State's homepage.
Yeah, no, we're going to re-up that, but the deadline for them to designate their early voting locations isn't until 14 days before the election. So
Okay.
before the early voting period. So we're getting those now. And as soon as we have them, we'll upload them and Mass Early Vote will go live with the real information and not just to our homepage.
Okay, fabulous.
It'll have the locations, the hours, contact information for all of the early voting locations.
Okay, wonderful. Let's see. Oh, so this is a follow-up to what happens to the mail ballot when someone votes in person. The person wants to know, where does the mail ballot go? Is it thrown out or what?
It depends on what the voter does with it. So if the voter brings the ballot back when they go to vote in person, it would be spoiled.
Mm-hmm.
And then that would be set aside. It's still retained, but it's spoiled. Sometimes the voter might not bring it back. And then hopefully it does get destroyed, but it will never be it should never be that a ballot would be counted twice, because once you vote in person now, again, your name is checked on the list, whether it was early voting in person or on election day. And if a ballot now is returned afterwards, it gets rejected as already voted.
Okay.
That's
great.
The sneaky trying to put it in the drop box afterwards.
Yeah. Right. Wonderful. All right, Nancy, do you see any other questions?
I don't see any other questions. I would just urge everybody to contact your local election officials and see if they need your help. You can open envelopes.
Yes, and I think there are loads of league members who already, who are inclined to do that already. So hopefully they will continue to do that. Michelle, let me just say thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate your time, and I think we all learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm always happy to be here and present to the league.
Great. Well, we look forward to working with you, going forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.